Welcome to the latest in our series of short talks looking at various types of early graffiti inscriptions found in English churches and elsewhere. For this talk, we will be talking about or looking at medieval ship graffiti. I say medieval, but we'll also be straying over into the post-Reformation period. So you're going to have to forgive me on that one. Medieval ship graffiti isn't one of the commonest types of graffiti that we come across, but we do come across an awful lot. So far, the various surveys running across England have recorded many, many hundreds of examples, such as this rather beautiful example from Gox Hill. Now, when we first started looking for ship graffiti, it was believed that it was largely confined to coastal areas. Now, the reason for that was because we were largely looking for it in coastal areas. As soon as we started looking inland, we began to realize that ship graffiti was found all over the country, such as this rather crude example from Flamstead in Hertfordshire. We have, in fact, found ship graffiti now in churches as far inland as Wiltshire and Leicestershire. You really couldn't get much further from the coast. So although we are still seeing very distinct concentrations of ship graffiti around coastal areas, particularly around ports and areas associated with shipbuilding, we are finding ship graffiti all over the country. Now, one of the questions I often get asked is, what is the earliest example of ship graffiti we've come across? Now, the usual answer for that is the example from Stow Minster in Lincolnshire, where they claim to have a piece of ship graffiti that depicts a Viking longship. So we're looking at pretty early. However, having visited there a few years ago and putting raking light across the surface, I realized that in fact it did appear to show that this Viking longship had an elevated rear deck, a poop deck. And when you looked closer, you could see that it was actually a fairly typical piece of late medieval ship graffiti. So sorry about that. So I'm afraid not that early after all. Now, some of the examples we come across are absolutely beautiful. I think this is probably why it's one of my favorite types of all the graffiti inscriptions we come across. This example from Norwich Cathedral is so detailed you can tentatively even identify a ship type. This is a fairly typical sort of fat-bellied lugger that you would have seen sailing around the coast of East Anglia and the North Sea in the late medieval period. It's showing various forms of decoration there on the stern, and you can see they've even made an attempt to mark out the hull, the planking on the hull, and very clear rudder there at the stern as well. And not a great deal of attempt has been made here to show much of the rigging detail. So you really can't sort of say that this is being done by a mariner or a sailor in particular. But other examples show even more detail. So this example from Cly up on the North Norfolk coast shows a very distinctive type of vessel that today is usually referred to as a cog or a cogger. Now, these turn up in a lot of manuscript illustrations, and they're usually quite distinctive in the fact that they have this very straight bow line, and the bow is often elevated well above the stern. This example from Cly, you can also see we have the rigging lines all running to the rear, exactly as we would see in a manuscript illustration. Now, a few of the examples are so detailed that they've actually included, well, they could be a representation of a real ship. This is an example from Bassingham up in Lincolnshire, dated to the late medieval or possibly early 16th century period. And it's so detailed, it could really just have sailed straight off the page of the Anthony Roll. This could well be a depiction of a real vessel that someone had seen. However, not all of them have to be that great or magnificent to include a lot of detail that you might find useful to a ship historian. This is a more typical example from Martham in Norfolk, and one of my absolute favourite ones because it is beautifully stylized. It is single-masted. You've got two main mast lines there. You've got a masthead or crow's nest at the top, as most of these vessels do, which indicates it's a seagoing vessel rather than a riverine craft. And if you look down towards the bow, you have a single line running forward. Now, if you follow that line all the way around the pier, eventually you would come to a little anchor. And that too is common on many of the examples of ship graffiti that we come across. Now, not all of them are quite so great. This rather wonderfully crude example is from Keddington in Suffolk. And as you can see, the artist here appears to have got slightly confused in the fact they appear to have placed a rudder at both ends. Now, normally these ships are, as you see, they are empty vessels, but in a few examples, we still have our crew on board. At Parham, down into Suffolk, we have a fantastic collection of graffiti in general, including harps and organs and various other bits of text, but also a wonderful collection of ship graffiti. And if you look very closely, as well as having the plank lines and rigging and our mastheads as usual, each of the vessels still has their little crew still aboard. You can just see their faces peering out over the side here. Now, Parham also has a rather lovely early example of ship graffiti. This has been dated to the 14th century, and as you can see, both at the bow and the stern, we have what appears to almost be fighting platforms. Now, again, it's single-masted, and there has been an attempt here to depict the plank lines. And again, if you look towards the bow, you'll see you have an anchor line running forward there. Now, some of these, it's clearly they are being created by people who'd had actually some knowledge of ships. So you'll find vessels in Suffolk or vessels in Northamptonshire or vessels in Kent that look remarkably similar. So with the Parham example, there's another example down at St Margaret's of Cliff in Kent, another church which has a fantastic collection of ship graffiti, which also appears to have these elevated fighting platforms on it. Now, you'll also see there, if you look towards the bow as well, you can just see one spur of the anchor, and you can just make out at the top of the mast, we have half of the masthead apparently showing. Now, I talk about typical examples of ship graffiti because the vast majority of the pre-Reformation vessels we get are shown pretty much in exactly the same way. They are shown as single-masted. They usually have the crow's nest or a masthead at the top of the mast. The sail is normally shown as furled. They will often have an anchor line with anchors attached to the other end, and they are shown as full hull. Now, what I mean by that is that they aren't depicted as you might normally see a ship, which is from the waterline upwards, but rather you're seeing the whole of the wooden hull, including that area which is normally below the waterline. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, there are exceptions, of course, to all these rules. There are a few examples, and they are really just a few, where the vessels are actually shown under sail, such as this rather beautiful sleek design from Cly up on the North Norfolk coast. It is almost tempting to think that this was a depiction of one of the ships in harbour, or leaving harbour, perhaps. Unfortunately, whoever did depict it seems to have shown the flag flying backwards, which would be a little unusual for a vessel at the time. Now, we are coming across quite literally hundreds of these ships all across our churches. And it's not just our churches, we're finding them on our castles, we're finding them on our stately homes as well. They can range, as I've said, from the very accurate, the very elaborate, right the way through to the very, very crude, such as the examples in the center of this composite image. In fact, those examples in the center there, if they weren't surrounded by other examples of ship graffiti, it really would be hard to classify them as being ship graffiti at all. So why then are our churches full of images of ships? Why then are they full of images of ships? which are shown in ways that you wouldn't normally see them in life. Why then are they shown always as full hull? Well, to answer that, or partially answer that, we have to go right up to the North Norfolk coast and the church at Blakeney. Now, Blakeney was once a thriving port. It was part of a group of parishes which are known collectively as the Glaven Port. They were an entry point for Baltic trade. They were an entry point for pilgrims arriving from the continent heading to nearby Walsingham. And as you can see from the size of the church, it certainly brought the parish a great deal of wealth. The trade ceased really in the 16th and 17th century, and today the parishes around Blakeney are more home to tourists and second homes than trading vessels, although probably slightly more wealthy. Now, Blakeney Church is absolutely packed full of early graffiti inscriptions. You have everything there from mason's marks through to merchant's marks, through to, rather elaborate text inscriptions, such as this one on the left, where the initial has actually been illuminated to mimic the style of a medieval manuscript. Now, Blakeney also has a rather fantastic collection of ship graffiti. There are over 80 examples in the church itself. Now, although the quantity is interesting, what's particularly interesting is the way they are distributed across the fabric. All of the examples of ship graffiti at Blakeney are found on one side of the church, and that is the piers of the South Arcade. Now, whilst they do appear on all of those pillars, it's this far pillar, this most easternmost pillar, where we have a mass concentration of ship graffiti. And as you can see, that pier sits opposite the side altar and a now restored image niche. Now, we do have an idea who that side altar was dedicated to. So whilst the church had its main altar up in the chancel and its Marian altar or Virgin Mary altar on the north side, this little smaller altar on the south side was dedicated to the church's patron saint. And in the case of Blakeney, that saint is St. Nicholas. Now, for those of you who don't know, as well as being associated with children and with Christmas, during the Middle Ages, St. Nicholas was also patron saint of those in peril upon the sea. So one of the suggestions here is that these little carved ships are in some way offerings to the shrine there, offerings to the altar of St. Nicholas, literally prayers to the saint himself, prayers made solid in stone. And it's not just at Blakeney Church that we see this possible association with St. Nicholas. Winchelsea Church down on the south coast, as you can see now, largely missing, also has a very fine collection of early graffiti inscriptions, including some rather lovely depictions of ships. Now, all of these ships are located in one area of the surviving church, and that is opposite the entrance to a side chapel that the documentary evidence indicates was once dedicated to St. Nicholas. And then if we move back to East Anglia, to St. Nicholas's Chapel in King's Lynn, sometimes known as the Sailors' or the Mariners' Chapel, we again have a great deal of ship imagery. The pews from St. Nicholas have largely been removed now, but we do have a number that survive, including this rather wonderful example that's now in the V&A. And as you can see, it includes a fantastic depiction of a ship, quite possibly a cog, which looks almost identical to the ship graffiti we're finding in the churches a little further round on the coast. And during a recent survey carried out for the Church's Conservation Trust in the South Porch, it was also found that we had examples of ship graffiti in there as well. So one of these suggestions then is that there is a link between St. Nicholas and examples and collections of ship graffiti, particularly in our maritime and coastal churches. That these are, in fact, offerings to that saint, prayers Now, exactly what those prayers were for, we don't know. Perhaps they were prayers for a safe voyage yet to come, or made in thanksgiving for, a returning from a safe, returning from a journey safely. We really don't know. Does that mean then that all of the ship graffiti we're coming across is related to St. Nicholas? Well, the simple answer is no. Although we have noted concentrations in churches dedicated to St. Nicholas and around altars and around chapels, the vast majority of ship graffiti, we can't find any such link. So why then should the rest of our churches also be full of images of ships? Well, the simple answer is during the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, a lot of our churches were already absolutely full of ships in the form of votive ships. Now, these are models of ships which are gifted to the church, often as a form of thanksgiving, much like the prayers. And they are still to be found in a few churches in England, notably All Hallows by the Tower and Clyde Church on the North Norfolk coast. If you go to Denmark, there are over 900 examples of these votive ships still to be found in Danish churches. Now, the tradition in Denmark is that at the end of your career as a captain on the sea, you would commission a model of the last vessel you commanded, and that would be presented to the church as thanksgiving for surviving your career upon the ocean. Now, we also know that this practice goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. The earliest example of a surviving ship model we have is the Mataro model on the bottom left here from about 1450. But we also have a number of illustrations that clearly show it was being carried out. This is Carapaccio's 1512 depiction of the apparition of the crucified on Mount Ararat in the Church of Sant Antonio di Castello. Apologies for the pronunciation. And if you look up into the roof section there of the church, you can still see a number of votive ships hanging there. We also know that these ships were being gifted by pilgrims to popular shrines throughout the Middle Ages. A surviving broadsheet from which is now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford depicts pilgrims kneeling at the shrine of Henry VI, dated to about 1490. Now, if you look to the left and right of the now sadly defaced king, you can just make out there are shelves with a number of images and statuettes, clearly ex voto items which had been presented to the shrine. And if you look to the top right where the arrow is, you can also see another ship very clearly hanging there. So many of these ships and many of these ship images may well be related to this idea of devotion and ex voto offerings. Many of them may in fact have been offerings in their own right, perhaps the poor man's ex voto, as it were. There are other examples, though, which don't quite fit into this pattern and may well have had more of a commemorative, or may have been created more as a commemoration. This is the church of Snargate, down on the edge of Romney Marsh in Kent. And if you look on the rear wall there, you can just make out there is a painting of a large vessel. Now, this was uncovered in the late 1960s, and at the time it was thought to have been created somewhere in the late medieval or early Tudor period. And it shows a large four-masted vessel, a carrack or a great ship, probably dating again, from the late medieval into the early Tudor period. Dr. Ian Friel has suggested that this may in fact represent a ship called the Regent. And the Regent was built just a few miles downriver at Reading Street. So this particular image may in fact be a depiction of a real ship that the people of Snargate would have known and possibly even been involved with the construction of. So why then would the people of this particular area of Kent be producing and interested in such depictions of ships? Well, the simple answer is, although it's today a rather sleepy, quiet, rustic area, During the later Middle Ages and early 16th century, this whole area of the Rother estuary, all the way up from Snargate through Reading Street and all the way up to Small Hythe, was one of the major shipbuilding centres of England. And this is Small Hythe Place, now owned by the National Trust. And if you go there today, it is a quiet, sleepy place. But during the during the early 16th century in particular, you would have found them constructing vessels like this, the Grand Mistress, which actually took part in the Battle of the Solent, in which the Mary Rose was lost. So these depictions on the walls of places like Snargate may in fact be commemorating real ships and real events that took place near to where they were created. In a few cases, the depictions we find may be commemorating real events that took place locally. So this is Blackfriar's Barn, Undercroft in Winchelsea. It's another National Trust site, and it is normally open to the public. It was built we believe, in the early 14th century, and shortly after someone plastered the walls of the Undercroft, they incised into it a whole series of images of ships. On the far wall of the Undercroft, there is an entire fleet of these little ships, which are, actually created, and we now know incised into the wet plaster of the wall. And we know that because when we examined it, you can just see where the lines of the ship graffiti have caused a curling in the edge of the plaster, indicating it was still damp at the time. So why then do we have an entire fleet of ships sailing across the walls of Winchelsea, the Blackfriar's Barn, Undercroft in Winchelsea? Well, it has been suggested that this may commemorate a particular event, and that is the Battle of Winchelsea, which took place in 1350 and was actually a early naval battle between the English and French fleets. Many of the vessels that took part in there would have actually left from Winchelsea itself, almost a stone's throw from the Undercroft. And it is tempting to think that someone who saw those vessels felt the need to commemorate the event on the walls in the plaster. Now, moving beyond the medieval, we move into the Reformation period and beyond. Ship graffiti doesn't simply stop with the end of the medieval period. In fact, some of the finest examples of ship graffiti are produced from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century onwards. This particular example is one of my favorites, and it's from Tudor House Museum in Southampton. It shows a race-built galleon from the late 16th century. And although you can't tell in this black and white photograph, although it's incised into the plaster, it has had pigment also added to it. So those flags at the top of the mast, the Cross of St. George, has actually been painted in. So these would have been highly visible on the walls of the building. It has been suggested as well that this relates to the defense against the Armada invasion or attempted invasion in 1588. And the vessel certainly fits the time period. And if you look closely down at the deck, you'll see that it's actually full of armed men. So you have little men there holding spears and bills. And below that, an entire row of cannon sticking out of the side of the hull. And then if you look towards the front of the vessel, if you look towards the bow, you'll note that there is what appears to be anti-boarding netting in place. So this really is a man of war sailing out ready to take on, well, perhaps the Spanish Armada, who knows. A lot of these post-Reformation examples are also highly detailed. They are being created by people who had seen these vessels and clearly understood them. These are examples which are actually carved into the wall of a barn at Wickham Manor down at Winchelsea. And there's a whole mass of graffiti there, including a lot of ships. The one on the left here is particularly of interest because it very clearly depicts a coastal cutter, as you can see there on the top right. And if you look behind the stern of the vessel and follow that line back, you can see it's actually towing its own little tender. Now, just like many of the medieval examples, a lot of these post-medieval examples look pretty much the same. We find a lot of very, very stylized vessels. So these two examples, one from Wickham Manor and one from Salthouse up in North Norfolk, look almost identical despite being half a country away. Now, I couldn't end a talk on ship graffiti without sharing one of my favorite sites, which contains some of the most magnificent ship carvings that you will find anywhere in the UK. And these are actually down in Harwich, in a timber-lined room known as, unsurprisingly, the ship room. Now, these carvings, as you can see, are absolutely beautiful. And the story is that this room was used as a jail or a holding cell for those people who had been caught by the press gang whilst they waited to be transferred to their new vessels. So this room would have been full of probably quite grumpy sailors. And to pass the time, they appear to have carved illustrations of their own vessels into the wall. And you can see just how detailed they are. These were clearly men who knew what they were depicting. So we have our full sails, our full hulls, rigging lines, and they even had time to use pigment to delineate the vessel as well. And the last one on there, I think, has to be my absolute favorite piece of post-medieval ship graffiti, clearly depicting a man of war ready for battle, gun ports open, and at full sail. The ship room is open upon occasion, back in the days when we are allowed to go out again, and it's certainly well worth a visit. If you would like to know any more about medieval shipping or about medieval ship graffiti, there's a couple of books that I can recommend. The first is by Dr. Ian Friel, The Good Ship, Ships, Shipbuilding and Technology in England, 1200 to 1520. And the second is my own medieval graffiti, The Lost Voices of England's Churches. If you'd like to know a little more about graffiti in general or interpretation, please visit our website, or you can follow me on Twitter @MedievalG. Many thanks for listening.